This week on Dig Me Out. With your hosts, Jason Ziak and Tim Minichi.
Jay, we're back again with another episode. This one is thanks to our Dig Me Out Union at Patreon, and also, we'll get into it, but it's thanks to our Dig Me Out Board of Directors at Patreon. Mm-hmm. And, of course, you can help us make the next episode happen by joining us at patreon.com/Dig Me Out. Now, I'll get into that real quickly here, Jay. This is our second roundtable of 2019, but it's the first one that was exclusively chosen by our board of directors at Patreon. We said we want to do one. Here's some genres of what we've done in the past or topics we've done. You know, we've done Digging Your Scene, we've done genre dissections, we've done In the 90s, Sophomore Slumps Revisited, and they picked a genre dissection. And then we said, okay, here's some different things that people have talked about us that we should cover. In our earlier roundtable, nu metal came up. So we said, would you like us to do a nu metal roundtable? And they said, no, we don't want you to do a nu metal roundtable. Here's the next option, pop punk. And they said yes. Yeah. So we're doing a pop punk roundtable, which slots in nicely, Jay. Last year we did power pop. A few years back we did punk. So I kind of feel like this is the natural progression through the 90s, weaving our way through the genres of the decade.
Very true. And a decade that obviously had many different genres that had their moment, obviously.
And we decided that since our power pop roundtable went so well last year, much like in Avengers 2 when they got the team back together, we decided to reassemble the Avengers of power pop. So we have brought back from around the country, from Texas, Mr. Eric Grubbs.
Hello. How y'all doing?
Great. Welcome back. Once again, you were here last month.
Yes.
You could co-host sometime if you want. I'm just saying one of us would like a break every once in a while. We've been doing this for 422 episodes in a row. We'd kind of, we need some CTO.
Maybe I could just impersonate one of you guys and hope that nobody could tell the difference. Hello and welcome to Dig Me Out Podcast. I'm not Tim Minichi. And I'm not Jason Ziak. Something like that.
No way that my voice is deeper than yours.
Yeah. No, you got to speak. From the great and I'm assuming very warm state of Florida, Jeff Takis, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Yeah, it's probably warmer here than where you are, Tim.
Well, today it was 57. On Thursday it was -20. So that was fun for my sinuses.
Yes. I can't say the same, Tim. Can't say the same. We never got to that -20 here in Florida.
That was fun. That was a whole lot of fun. And then, if I'm remembering correctly, from the state of Michigan, am I right, Ryan?
You nailed it.
We won't talk about football, but we will talk about your band, Extra Arms, and the great record you put out last year, Headacre. Everybody should go and stream that or buy it if it's available. I don't know. There was a limited run of vinyl. Is there still vinyl available?
Oh, of course there is.
Okay. Go buy that. It's a good record. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Hey, it's me, Ryan. Alan.
We're going to talk about pop punk. So I'm going to be the first one to say I'm not clear on what differentiates pop punk from punk. I can kind of guess what differentiates it from power pop, but punk is a little trickier. So I want to go around the room before we get into our Patreon comments and ask, what is something that makes pop punk unique to you versus just regular punk music? Ryan, since I ended with you in the introductions, I'm going to start with you. What's something that makes pop punk unique?
Well, I think the best way to answer it is how, in my mind, it's different than just straight punk, and I feel like sort of straight up punk is angry and kind of rallying against something, whereas pop punk seems to be a little bit more about having a good time. It's a little bit goofier and not as sort of anti-establishment. If you think about pop punk and how it sort of became more mainstream. I mean, it was on TRL MTV, embraced by teenagers, and on the radio, right alongside whatever else was popular, Backstreet Boys or whatever it was. So, I don't think the Clash or the Ramones or the Sex Pistols would have ever imagined such mainstream success with a musical genre with the word punk in it. So to me, it's a friendlier, more colorful, and perhaps a little bit more accessible version of punk rock.
So, okay. So friendlier attitude and lyrical subject matter. Would be
start
it
there, I'm sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll
All
let
right.
the other guys talk musically, maybe. But
Eric, what would be one thing that you think differentiates pop punk from maybe some of the other sounds of punk or power pop?
This is definitely branching off of what Ryan just said, but essentially you're not afraid to be very warmly melodic. All music has melody, whether it's like anti-melodic or like anything. But the point is like it's not afraid to be melodic, as in you want to sing on key, you want your guitars to be on key, and that was kind of seen as like a polished up way of punk rock. But I think when you had a band like the Descendants, they really knew how to have that kind of rough edges, but also not be afraid to be melodic.
Okay. Jeff, anything to add to the options of what makes pop punk slightly different than punk?
Yeah, I like what some of the others said about it being a bit more accessible and, being brighter. A couple of things that come to my mind to add to that are a lot of times pop punk bands will use harmonies, vocal harmonies, maybe more than a traditional punk band. And I would also like to add just kind of thinking about, concept of like tracing all the way back to like the Beach Boys, and thinking about some of the songs that they did, and then thinking about those songs being a lot faster with an edge would be how I would define pop punk.
Yeah, I think the harmonies are maybe the slight influence of the power pop end of pop punk. Maybe.
It's possible. I mean, it's we'll probably get into a little bit of the history here in a little bit, but
yeah.
Yeah.
So we did get some comments, and some of this plays into what they said over at Patreon, who I have to mention, Whitney Beeler jumped up from the 5 to the 1950 level, which means he's on our board of directors now. He's helping us pick not only our roundtables, but also our 80s episodes, which will have our first one coming up in the month of February. I'm not going to reveal what it is just yet, but there was a winner. We did not have a tie, correct, Jay?
Yes. They look close, but yes, we have a winner.
Excellent. So, do you have that page open with the comments for the Pop Punk Roundtable?
It's loading.
Okay. Well, I'll get to them because there were a couple that I wanted to highlight. I'll start with Tara McCook. She says, I can't wait for this discussion. I'm interested to see what the consensus is on the line between pop punk and quote-unquote real punk, which I think we've started to address there. Pop punk was attractive to me because back then I was the right age for it. I was 13 the year Dookie came out, but the pop punk side of the scene was also less doctrinaire about who got to come to the party, so it was an easier point of entry. The real punks I knew looked down on pop punk, and you weren't considered punk until you took off the quote-unquote training wheels and devoted your life to the Discord back catalog. I was more interested in moshing with my friends to the accessible stuff. Of course, there's also a line between pop punk and ska. That's right, those dreaded checkers again. We had a lot of bands in our local scene that were right on the dividing line. If you were remotely punk and lived on the Gulf Coast in the mid-90s, for example, I probably saw you at a Pain show. There's a lot to parse here, is what I'm saying. Pain show is, I don't know what that band is. Gulf Coast, anybody know what Tara is referencing there?
I'm going to refer to
Nope.
Jeff.
I was gonna say I'm afraid not. I grew up in Philadelphia, so I just migrated to Florida.
Gotcha. So Tara stumped us.
Yep.
That is an important point, though, because at least maybe up until the 90s, it seemed like there was a rigidity to punk in terms of its who's punking, in that Jawbox.
What's the score?
Jawbreaker.
Or Jawbreaker, excuse me, line.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4. Who's punk? Who's what's the score?
Exactly. It seems like maybe in what Tara mentioned that there was an opening up in pop punk to a broader audience that maybe was less intimidated.
I was going to say, to jocks.
Right. Which is interesting because that's not where punk started, and then it turned into, in some respects, a very jockish, macho, which you can read various books and watch, like the Salad Days documentary on DC hardcore would be an example of when punk went hardcore. That kind of, which we covered it in her ska. That's probably one we're going to have to get to as far as the genre, and I know Jeff will be on that episode.
Yeah, I'm pretty stoked.
Yeah, and then hardcore is a whole nother, because we talk about post-hardcore a lot, but we don't actually get into hardcore a lot. Jay, do you have that page up?
Yeah, Justin Wexler said it's interesting because the 90s started with two dominant flavors of pop punk. The more hardcore influenced epitaph type stuff, Bad Religion, NoFX, Pennywise, and the obviously Ramones 50s pop influenced Lookout type stuff, Screeching Weasel, The Queers, Mr. T Experience. Yet both sort of evolved into the mainstream. Mainstream mall, Hot Topic punk. Oh, Hot Topic. That dominated the 2000s. New Found Glory, Taking Back Sunday, some lesser known 90s bands definitely worth checking out. Zoinks, Chicks Dig It, Hagfish, which we recently had up in a poll. The Parasites, Weston, and China Drum.
I've not heard of most of those, other than Hagfish, because, like you mentioned, it was in a poll.
Yeah.
So that's interesting because I believe Epitaph, and Lookout are both California-based punk labels, right?
Yep.
But it seemed like the two different labels were going in two different directions in terms of their output. I'm not that familiar. I know that Lookout was the home of Green Day originally. Is that right?
And Operation Ivy.
Okay. So I guess one of the things we need to talk about, and this came up in one of the other comments, is does pop punk actually start with the 90s? I always kind of thought it did, but then when you start tracing it back to the Ramones or the Buzzcocks or the Jam, what is your all's opinion on, is pop punk a 90s phenomenon, or is it something that in retrospect would be applied to bands from as far back as the 70s? Eric, what are your thoughts on that?
I would say pop punk as a term really started in the 90s, but it was very cyclical from what happened in the late 70s as well as going into the mid 80s. Is that you had punk, which was very rough around the edges, and then you get it very polished and you have it as new wave. You also have all these punk bands, but the thing is that they were not scared of, it being more than just an angry, angular sort of dirty rock band. And so that's where you had like Green Day, Bad Religion, NoFX, all those Fat Wreck and Epitaph bands that, and also Pennywise and Face to Face, is that there was just this melodicism that really came to the forefront. And, you can kind of look at it as like a trend in music, but as far as a style, it wasn't necessarily new. I will say this, you listen to a Strung Out song that was released in 1997, much faster than a Knack song in the 80s. Let's just put it that way.
Gotcha. Well, I guess I have to me, I think we have to talk a little bit about the production sound of pop punk, being it seems to me that it's very like clean, and especially in the guitars, it is much more dialed down. Like when I think of like say the Sex Pistols or even the Ramones, some of the Ramones stuff, like the guitars are pretty raw, whereas when you listen to, you know, Enema of the State, those guitars are pretty pristine, and it's very radio friendly in terms of the production. So it would be hard to like retroactively apply that backwards.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, a lot of them are like metal tones. I don't know. Maybe that's what they were using. You know, buying cheap, you know, secondhand metal guitars and amp setups that definitely had a super compressed, sometimes very kind of classic metal sound when you really just isolate the guitars.
Oh yeah, and you had a band like Lagwagon. All those guys were into metal, and so, but they wanted to be a little bit more melodic, and suddenly, bam, they have pop punk. Face to Face, Matt Riddle and Trevor Keith were huge Iron Maiden fans, and but then they got hit to you know, No Control by Bad Religion, and I think Milo Goes to College by the Descendants, and suddenly they were like, yeah, let's do this instead. You know, so it's like they came from that hardcore punk background, and they just decided to be more melodic.
I think you can hear it a lot in the drum tones as well. Like, I think people are obviously going to focus on the guitars and the vocals, but I think something that really sticks out to me when I hear that kind of music is how clicky the kick drum can be, and how sort of cranked and sort of like clangy and high tonality wise the snare drum ends up being. So it kind of has this like, it's like I would assume is very intentional to kind of cut through. So it kind of moves the song quickly through and really kind of hits people in a way where you immediately kind of connect with it. And you don't have to like search for, you know, if you listen to like, obviously the, you know, drum tones of the Buzzcocks or the Undertones, or, you know, any bands that sort of might be, you know, claimed as like, you know, I guess like grandfathers of the genre, like, you know, those drum tones and guitar tones and the way everything was kind of presented was not as in your face as, you know, it sort of became in the 90s. And I think the advent of computers and playing to a grid and kind of being able to kind of like make things sound perfect, auto-tune, like all these things started to kind of like crop up a little bit later in the 90s, but like by the 2000s, I mean, it was pretty much the norm for all of these bands to be playing, you know, to a click track and being very like, you know, gridded out and sort of like everything cleaned up to a T on a computer.
Huh.
Yeah, I can hear that too. The drum sound is sometimes polarizing for me with some of these bands because it's so sharp and cutting.
Yeah, I think it's important to note, like, thinking about this era and talking about, you know, punk rock in the 90s, there were punk bands in the 90s that got popular who weren't playing pop punk. And I think that's an important distinction talking about a band like Bad Religion or even Face to Face. I personally don't lump either band into that category, despite, you know, both bands having some level of popularity in the decade. I feel like that should be stated in this conversation that, you know, some of the bands that got big, you know, thinking about like, you know, the Offspring or bands like that may have gotten popular, but I don't know if I would consider them a pop punk band. I think that's a good distinction.
Well, and those bands were putting out records in the '80s, kind of before any of that type of music kind of got co-opted and a label slapped on it. I mean, and I would say that one of Bad Religion's best records actually came out in the '90s, which is Stranger Than Fiction. But I agree with you. I don't think either of those bands, while they're melodic to an extent, they were on a whole different trip. They weren't trying to get on MTV. They did, but that wasn't their goal.
So I want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to interject. The thing about Face to Face is that I related to the music when I was a teenager. I relate to it in a different way as a 20-year-old, and now as I'm about to turn 40, it's like I relate to it even more. So it's like they were different in terms of they weren't singing about, hey, my mom sucks and my job stinks and I want to get out of this town, that kind of stuff. It was definitely not juvenile, which is a common tendency in a lot of pop punk.
So I want to throw in a comment from Alex Gibson over our Patreon page. He said, "It's probably partly because I live far from the land of the Warped Tour, but I never heard the term pop punk until All the Small Things was everywhere. I certainly don't consider the bands of the first half of the 90s to be pop punk. They are just punk, or if you need a subgenre suffix, melodic punk. I lost interest in this sort of music after Green Day made it big because everyone I heard seemed to be trying to sound like them. That said, I have a large soft spot for Nimrod. Pop punk only came into being when things changed from making punk rock that made money, such as Green Day or The Offspring, to making punk rock to make money. The journey from Milo Goes to College to Enema of the State is the same journey as was made from Black Sabbath's Paranoid to Warrant's Cherry Pie." So I don't know if it's that big a gap. That seems like a much bigger gap between Paranoid and Cherry Pie. But I think there's something to be said where bands heard, or maybe teenagers that were just learning their instruments, they hear Green Day, and they hear the melody that Joe Armstrong has a knack for, and they follow that same route, or even The Offspring, but it gets polished in the 90s way because of the fact, like you mentioned, Ryan, with now there's computers to record on as opposed to analog, and there's you can get a cleaner sound, and also that's the first generation that has been completely grown up now. If they're making music in 95, 96, that means they grew up on MTV. They have an idea of like music being more than just records you buy. It's a whole industry. It's a whole image thing, and they're being and rock music being pop music crossing over in the 90s. So I don't know if I agree that it's as, I don't know, that seems dismissive to me to call it cherry pie to compare it to Paranoid, but I think there's definitely something to be said that there's a line with Green Day and maybe The Offspring as well. Did anyone else see that from Alex's point of view as well with regards to where Green Day stands in all this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I think maybe a little bit closer comparison could be, Blink-182 is to Green Day as, Silverchair is to Nirvana or something like that, where, look, you cannot discredit or take for granted how incredibly talented of a songwriter Billy Joe from Green Day was, and how influential that band was for a generation of kids who were already probably, I mean, at least in my case, into Nirvana and Pearl Jam and grunge, and kind of like starting to wrap their heads around playing music and, trying to figure out how to play guitar, and then hearing Green Day, at least for me, it was very much the same kind of Ramones type of, thing that many people who are a bit older than me, hearing the Ramones said, I can do that. I had a very similar experience with Green Day where I was already in Nirvana, but it seemed like a little bit out of my grasp, even though it was very simple and straightforward. And then, when I heard Dookie and then some of those records before it, I was very much like, okay, this is like the Beatles, but faster. And, you know, it seemed like I could pull it off, you know? And I think a ton of kids really responded to that and started bands. Some of those bands are god awful, and some of those bands rule, you know? And so, I mean, same thing with Nirvana, you know, there's a ton of bands that kind of sprouted from that suck, you know, and we can make a list a mile long. But I guess my point is, you know, there's always going to be some band that like lights that fire, and then, you know, there's going to be a domino effect where, you know, the bands that follow are going to go in maybe a lot of different directions, and you're going to get some crap and you're going to get some really good shit. And, you know, I think in Green Day's case, you know, they were already coming into their own and coming out of something that was like a little bit more juvenile and starting to mature and, you know, write records like, you know, Nimrod and Warning and stuff like that, which to me are really great examples of a band that like tried to push its limits despite what was trending.
We're living in repetition. Contending the same old stick again. Now the routine's turned into contention, like a production line going over and over and over roller coaster. Now I cannot speak, lost my voice, speechless and redundant, 'cause I love you's not enough. I'm lost for words.
Yeah, and you also got to think about how kind of the culture was as far as pop culture from 1991 until 1994. It was all about like this, you know, this complete antithesis to hair metal, but it was all dark and it was all openly talking about taking drugs. I mean, Alice in Chains' Dirt is essentially all about taking heroin. And so then Kurt Cobain kills himself, and like a lot of teenagers, like I think all of us, were kind of like, well, what are we going to listen to next? And so along comes Longview, and suddenly it's like, man, this is kind of that same angsty thing, but it's not openly talking about, you know, being addicted to heroin. And instead it's just like, I'm bored and I just want to rage. And it was just kind of like, it was such a much more accessible thing because it wasn't so serious, you know?
Well, it's totally relatable. I mean, it's about jerking off, you know, and any 15-year-old who heard that's like, yeah, I do that. I mean, I remember riding around in the car when that song would come on the radio, and that part would come up, and I would like try to like figure out how to accidentally change the channel so my mom didn't hear it. You know what I mean? But it was like it really hit you as a teenager if you were a teenager, you know, in 1993 or 4 or whenever that record came out. You know?
Yeah, and you know, thinking about the analogy that kind of started this little part of the conversation off, I've been thinking about it as I've been listening to the answers, and I don't disagree with the analogy, but I have another offering to the analogy, which I think is a better description. At the end of that, they were comparing kind of like Blink-182 to Warrant. I actually would take out Blink and I would insert a band like Lit, and then I think you have an equal analogy of what that person was trying to illustrate that point.
Lit came up in our discussion on Patreon. Whitney Bueller said, I'm more fond of the pop punk of the 2000s. There was a lot of it, and I love the melodies and harmonies and the occasional desire to play more than 3 chords. I get it. Punk was dangerous and had something rebellious to say, but I really only enjoyed straight-up punk music when I was in a particularly bad mood, which isn't often. Preferences are subjective. I never consider pop punk to be entirely ripped off from punk. It was lighter in lyrical content and mood, which we discussed. But what's wrong with that, Grumpy Gus? So angry all the time. So thinking about a few oddities, or maybe songs by bands that certainly must have influenced the later explosion, he mentioned All's album She's My Ex, Bob Goblin's One Down, One Across, The Descendants' I'm the One, Jimmy Eat World's song Your New Aesthetic, Lit's My Own Worst Enemy, Presidents of the United States of America, Lump, and Sugar's Helpless.
I can't. I'm sorry. I have to jump in. I can't contemplate. I'm not having to do everything I can to keep my head attached to my body, thinking about All and the Descendants being in the same category as Lit. I'm sorry. Like, whoever said that, like, much love to you, but I can't. Like, Lit would be in a completely different category to me than, you know, bands like All and the Descendants.
I don't know enough of the Lit catalog to even know if are they really a punk band? I just know that really annoying guitar riff that bore into my head.
All the years that I have been doing podcasts with Jeff Takis, I have finally heard him be somewhat angry. I'm like, wow.
Right.
And I agree with him. I mean, it's more like this. It's like it kind of all kind of blended together by like 97, 98, so where it's kind of like, well, this band's, you know, they're kind of dressing the part, but do they really sound the part? And in the case of Lit, they dress like punks, but they just were kind of like a radio rock band, which at that time was kind of the only way that you could get played on the radio. And I believe at last check, they're now a country band. I'm not kidding. They're like a country band. So
are you serious?
Yeah, because they want to fit in with the market that has the most money, other than hip hop or pop. So, we have.
I didn't think it was possible to have less respect for that band than I do.
Yeah. There's a whole other angle going on here of like, why was it in the 90s? It was all like, you either were pop punk, and if you weren't, you were a sellout. So how come it's okay that all these like guys that are fully tatted up about punk rock and punk rock ethos then put on a Stetson and go yeehaw, and it's totally acceptable that they're a country band? Just don't get it.
It's not.
Anyway, back to you.
We don't accept it. We reject it. That doesn't work for us.
I think in the as the 90s progressed and Green Day got successful and kind of started this explosion, because let's face it, like after they exploded, all the major labels tried to find the next Green Day. So they, you know, and some of them got some like hits from that. I mean, obviously Blink-182 became huge. And so then you start to go after that. And that's like when you start like in the late 90s, when, as Eric was talking about, the lines got fuzzy, and all of a sudden, like a band like an All, who, you know, continued to put records out into the 2000s, you know, could be considered a pop punk band, but yet then you have more of these radio rock bands that emerge, you know, like Lit, like Good Charlotte, you know, some bands like that are, it's kind of like this concept of like a carbon copy of a carbon copy of a carbon copy of a carbon copy. And that's the distinction for me from some of those bands. So, you know, someone somewhere can probably trace with a really thin pencil a line between those different bands, but they're so far removed from one another. And it just so happened that like those two bands, like thinking about All and Lit, were putting out records roughly at the same time, but they sound nothing alike.
Right. Yeah.
I was gonna say too that it's kind of similar to what Jeff was saying. You know, you get kind of further away from the influence, right? So like, you know, Green Day, if we're gonna kind of use them as like the barometer here, like, you know, they were influenced obviously by the Ramones, I think is a pretty clear one. But, you know, I mean, Billy Joe has been, you know, pretty adamant about his love for, you know, the Replacements and for Husker Du and these bands that were, you know, making punk kind of sounding music that was also melodic, but, you know, kind of ragtag and, you know, with songs that sort of were emotional and all of that. And then, you know, that sort of filters into what they're doing. And then they kind of, you know, take that, you know, torch and start running with it. But then, you know, next thing you know, this tiny band from, Berkeley or wherever they're from, California becomes, the biggest band in the world. And, as they move further away from that influence, the kids who form bands post Green Day also start to get further away from that kind of, more sort of quote unquote credible influences that Green Day might have, so the influences start to narrow, and then, bands start cropping up that are really only influenced by something that's, about as young as they are, in terms of what they're looking back to is not super far back, so that's where you get Sum 41. That's where you get, Lit. That's where you get, something corporate. Is that a band? I don't even know.
Yeah.
I'm trying to, pull bands out of a hat here at this point, but their understanding of the history of punk is less, the depth of it is not as significant as a Green Day or even an Offspring, perhaps, who I'm not a fan of, but, I think that they probably were tapping a little bit more into, the kind of harder edge stuff that we referenced earlier, and then maybe a little bit of, Van Halen too or something.
Yeah, here's just kind of like a trajectory that I'd like to share. Sorry, Jason. It was like this. Blink-182 was originally just this fun pop punk band, and then they spoofed boy bands in the video for All the Small Things. Then they became marketed essentially as a boy band. And to just kind of go off of what Ryan was just saying, is that there was this British trio called Busted. Do y'all remember that band?
No.
Okay. They just had hits in England. I think their record had come out in America long after they first broke through. But they were just three guys. It was like two guitarists and a bassist. It was essentially a pop band. And they were exactly the Blink-182 model, just playing to all these teenage girls in England. And it was like, I couldn't help but be cynical about that. At the same time, I think Enema of the State is still one of the best records that Blink-182 has done. And I talked about it on the last episode, Roundtable, with you guys. So it's just more of a matter of, there's a great record, and then there's a bunch of just kind of, not so great stuff that comes out afterwards. It's just the cyclical nature of the recording industry.
And I just wanted to call out not to lose the Offspring in this whole story, because if memory serves, for me at least, they were the ones to kind of break this whole thing open, right? I mean, they were the first one I remember to have a big radio breakthrough song, and then it seemed like after that it was a trickle, and then all of a sudden it exploded within a couple years of a lot of bands that we're talking about now starting to come out. Not that I'm a huge fan of theirs, but they were the first one that I remember having a major radio hit.
Separated. Hey, the man you're disrespecting me. Take him out. You gotta keep them separated. Hey, don't pay no mind. We're under 18 and won't be doing any time. Hey, come out and play.
I distinctly remember the summer of 1994. It was Basket Case, Longview, and Come Out and Play. Keep them separated. I mean, that was constantly on MTV and radio, and it's just like coincidental that it's all like Longview came out just like a month after Kurt Cobain died.
And I think that like that time, and thinking about like those two bands, Green Day and Offspring, they're running in parallel to me, in that, by the way, Offspring's record Smash, which is the one that has Come Out and Play on it, this is a crazy fact, it's the greatest selling independent release in music history.
Wow.
Which is mind-blowing to think about.
I didn't know it was independent.
Yeah, Epitaph released that record.
Oh, okay.
And they made a ton of money off of it. But those two bands are like, so before we were talking about like the distinction between kind of like a melodic punk, some call it like skate punk, and pop punk. Those two bands, again, both got wildly popular. Summer '94, those videos were all over, like Eric said. But I would say that one of the two of them was a pop punk band, which is Green Day, while the other was more of a, kind of like the '90s version of what punk rock became in that kind of skate punk, Epitaph model. And I think that's actually a really good, like, because they don't sound alike. They both got popular right around the same time, but they have very different sound.
So where does Rancid fit in all this? We haven't talked about them, and they had a pretty unique sound.
Yeah,
I'm pretty successful.
I mean, they were dogged for years about sounding too much like the Clash. I think they just kind of sounded like their own. I mean, and Out Come the Wolves. That's a phenomenal record.
Oh yeah, classic.
Holds up really well.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
I mean, Rancid are fucking punk. They're punk. I mean, look at them. First of all, I would not fuck with any of those guys.
Is that the test?
Lars, I think that's the test.
Whether
Lars
you're pop punk
Fredrickson-
or just punk is whether or not you would fuck with the band.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I could beat up all the guys in Lit. I'm pretty sure I can take Rancid. I'm almost positive could beat my ass very quickly. But that band, even though I was not super into them, back in the '90s, I've grown to really respect who they are and what they did, and I think that they're yes, the Clash influence is you can't argue with it, but they really mix genres with ska and punk and kind of pub rock and all this stuff that some of these other bands who are classified as pop punk wouldn't dare touch, and they did it in a way that was purely done as fans of music. I mean, Rancid is one of the probably most popular record nerd bands I can think of. I mean, those guys clearly love music, and I tip my hat to them because they did what they wanted and they did it their way, and they still wrote some really great super melodic, catchy songs that like landed. I mean, Time Bomb is a really great song, and for my money, Ruby Soho is one of the fucking best, if you want to call it pop punk or whatever you want to call it, punk songs of the '90s, without a doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for Rancid, like that record and Out Come the Wolves, I think that was like, it was the right time at the right place, for them to release that record. I mean, obviously, has been talked about before, that band, came from the ashes of Operation Ivy, a band that also did their own thing, had a sound that was unique to themselves. Rancid, very similar. I think if an Out Come the Wolves came out, 18 months before or after it did, I think the group here on this roundtable would still be talking about how amazing it is. It just wouldn't have been on MTV.
Yeah, definitely.
So,
because like Epitaph was going so strong thanks to the Offspring money,
Right.
like that Descendants record, Everything Sucks. That's one of their best records.
Right.
Yeah.
Pennywise had released About Time, which was at that point one of their biggest sellers. Now you can knock Pennywise off because it's like they're so scared that if they expand, the kids aren't going to like them. But they had a good string of records and very distinct sound, positive message, great guitar playing, great singing, great lyrics. And so, yeah, I mean, Epitaph was kind of untouchable for a few years. And so was Fat Wreck. I mean, God, like those Propagandhi records, as well as the Strung Out and Lagwagon records. I mean, yeah. So for people like us, I mean, like Ryan, Jeff, and I are all kind of in the same age. It's like this was our music for our time. And so anytime, I see like younger generations getting into their version of pop punk, I can understand how the older generations wouldn't like it as much, but you got to give respect to like teenagers getting excited about music, especially in the pop or punk vein.
here's an aspect that I really want to bring up, and it was brought up for a moment in the comments by Jay, which is Hot Topic and also the Warped Tour. And I'm bringing those up because it seems to me that in mentioning like Offspring being the highest selling independent release, and then the origins of Green Day, that a lot of punk starts underground, whereas it seemed to me pop punk doesn't have that underground lineage, and that parallels with the fact that basically by the mid 90s it had its own punk/pop punk had its own dedicated tour with the Warped Tour, and if you wanted to dress like someone who was in quote unquote a pop punk band, you would have your store of choice being Hot Topic to go to, and they would, you know, have all these things that you would, whatever the accoutrements were for a pop punk look. Am I wrong in saying that pop punk has more of a mainstream appeal because it was built a little bit more for the mainstream? Not that it was built intentionally, but just that it seems to be not something that has risen out of a underground scene in the same way that punk obviously did, not only in the 90s but in the previous decades.
I don't know if I would agree wholeheartedly with that, Tim. I just think about like that concept of there being an underground scene. I mean, there were a ton of bands that would play what I would consider to be pop punk, you know, in the like 924 Gilman Street scene in the East Bay alone, that were very good, but never saw mainstream success. I mean, you know, probably the biggest example of that would be the Mr. T Experience. So I think there is an underground for this genre, you know, back when it started in the 90s and, you know, even, you know, today. But I think the problem is it gets victimized by the actual music itself because it's just more accessible of music. And so it's got this punk word on it, but it's more accessible. And so it's easy to think like, you know, that it could be like a creation of like for-profit companies, you know, wanting to make money. And then of course, like, you know, talking about like, you know, later years or, you know, the first kind of 3 or 4 or 5 years of Warped Tour, like, you know, kind of the commercialization, commoditization of punk rock happened and Hot Topic. That part I wholeheartedly agree with, that all happened. But I mean, thinking about the Warped Tour itself, I was happy and lucky enough to go to the second iteration of Warped Tour, and the bands that I saw that day are not what you would think of when you think of like, you know, mall punk rock. You know, I saw Rocket from the Crypt that day, Down by Law, Dance Hall Crashers. You know, I mean, just bands that, you know, are kind of like afterthoughts nowadays, but, you know, never got big commercially. But again, after several years of Warped Tour and, you know, van sponsorships and, you know, just so many other corporations getting involved, so did the popularity of the bands that played it, et cetera.
Well, and then also by the end of the decade, you have the Total Request Live, where bands like Blink-182 are dominating that, and then into the early 2000s, you know, a band like Sum 41 I read was constantly at number 1 with their song Fat Lip. That was all over Total Request Live. And it seemed like that was a complete, like, that was the antithesis of if you were a punk in the traditional sense, to see the most commercial outlet for music embracing and showcasing the music of that genre, that would seem to be like an indication that maybe this is over. Maybe there's no more. Maybe there isn't punk and rock anymore. Maybe it's just all just mainstream rock or mainstream punk. I don't know if there's even a terminology for mainstream punk. But like all those bands I can remember, like Fall Out Boy and Good Charlotte and stuff, you know, all appearing on there just as if it was just the normal thing to do. Just MTV is just a part of their world as far as being in a pop punk band, which seemed unthinkable, at the beginning of the 90s. In the same way that Nirvana being on MTV would be unthinkable and sort of in 5 or 6 years before they broke. So, which just leads me into where we're at the end of the decade, going into the 2000s. I mentioned a couple of the bands.
Before we go into that,
okay.
I want to. So I'm kind of shocked doing my research, and even in this discussion, an artist hasn't come up as being really influential to all this. And that's Joan Jett. Like, isn't she the prototype for pop punk in terms of legitimate punk roots? I mean, she was in England during the big punk explosion. She played with the Sex Pistols. Her partner's Kenny Laguna, who is like a pop writing mastermind. She is like the first person to put, other than the Ramones, like the first one to put like sugary, super hooky melody together with punk. And I guess, and she was very like involved in the 90s with helping a lot of different bands, and being very much, grounded in grassroots. Why do you, is that am I off base here? And then if I'm not, why is she not talked about more as being part of this scene and or influential to it?
I can answer that very easily. The pop punk in the 90s is basically a boys club,
Yep.
And I mean, when I was doing my research, going back and Googling pop punk in the 90s with quotation marks around it, there is not a single band that I remember coming up that had even a female member, let alone a female singer, and it was a real, I think, when I think about the later era of pop punk in the 90s, it was a real dark time for for kind of equality and like what representation. I mean, yes, there are definitely bands with women in it. I'm not saying that there weren't, but and no doubt could be, even though they're not classified as a punk rock or pop punk band, they were kind of floating in that same genre. And arguably one of the biggest bands of that era, and Gwen Stefani being one of the most iconic singers and front persons of any band. But even though to me Joan Jett is super influential, she was in the Runaways, who certainly were planting a seed for what potentially became pop punk. It was a male dominated, very, in my mind, chauvinistic, kind of very sexist, honestly, genre of music near the sort of late 90s or whatever. And you can make the same argument for grunge, for sure. Like who besides L7 and Babies in Toyland and Hole, were women really represented as well as they could have been? Probably not. But to me, it was like a bunch of, guys who were making dick and fart and jokes and burping and being just like assholes, and their fan base were maybe predominantly women, or young teenage girls, but Jesus, like show me a more white male genre of music that exists. I dare you,
That's
metal.
a good point. Well, yeah.
Yeah, new metal might actually be the only thing that surpasses it. Although Evanescence was pretty big, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think somebody like Joan Jett sadly gets pushed aside because it was such a dude-centric, frat party with guitars.
Right. You don't really get any sort of female-driven pop punk until the 2000s. I know Avril Lavigne has been referred to as pop punk. Paramore, would that be considered pop punk when they started?
No. I would think of like Lunachicks and Tilt, these, and those were great bands, and they had female. Yeah, they had females on the lead vocals. Great bands. But yeah, it was definitely dominated by. I mean, so much of pop punk in the '90s was dominated by essentially the hopes and dreams and lots of fears of the 15-year-old suburban boy, the one that didn't want to be totally accepted by people, didn't want to be trendy, didn't want to be all this. And so there was all this backbiting about oh, since this band is on this label, you can't like this band anymore. And it was just, I don't know, it kind of exhausted itself to the point where people got more interested in, say, ska or emo or hardcore. And it's yeah, by the end of the 90s, it was just kind of man, anything goes. It was either, you could take the route of Screeching Weasel or the Parasites, or you could try to take the trajectory of Blink-182. And it was just more of it was just going all over the place. And then, well, Face to Face was doing their own thing, and they're still one of the greatest bands ever made. And Don't Turn Away is one of my all-time favorite records, released in 1992. Bam.
So where does that leave us then? We got into a little bit with the 2000s bands, an artist, but not entirely. I kind of checked out listening to the radio and watching MTV by 98, 99. Jay and I have discussed this before. So I would see these names like Fall Out Boy, Newfound Glory, Good Charlotte, and I had no idea what any of these bands were doing or what they sounded like. They just all seemed to be wearing eyeliner and black, flamed shirts and have spiky hair. And I'm I don't understand what's going on with this look. And I turned away from all that. So are there bands from that era that you guys would point to? Whether it's a Panic from the Disco, I don't know, or someone else that you'd point to and go, that's a strong lineage for pop punk into the 2000s. Yellow Card, I don't know. What bands should I be checking out that I don't know of?
MXPX.
Yeah.
And if you want even more modern example, Masked Intruder. That band's incredible.
Masked Intruder, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think to answer your question, Tim, taking that next step. So 90s comes to an end. You're looking at the early 2000s. Where does that lineage go? I agree with Eric. I still love MXPX. I actually like Newfound Glory. I think that's when you think about that next step, I would point to that band. I know that some folks find them hokey or whatever, but they put out some great records in the very late 90s and then into the early 2000s. So thinking about kind of what we were talking about as far as elements of, so this carbon copy of a carbon copy of a carbon copy thing is happening, then when you go back to more of the bands that are more rooted in the Ramones and more rooted in that element of pop punk, those bands went back underground. That music didn't stop. It's just it went underground. And so there are bands that are playing music today that are very Ramones influenced pop punk. Eric mentioned Masked Intruder. There are some later bands that I would, kind of current bands like Teenage Bottle Rocket, I would include in that. The Lillingtons. There's a ton of bands that are still making music today that have that lineage to pop punk. But again, after that explosion happened and the ripple effect started, the core of that music, as the Good Charlottes and others cropped up, it went back underground.
Does Fall Out Boy have any lineage to this? I know they've done a lot of other types of music, but is there a root there?
There were comparisons early into their career, but then they became more of an emo pop punk band. And keep in mind, a lot of bands that were considered emo were technically more pop punk influenced. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about Cartel or All American Rejects. But it just kind of came down to marketing. But it was definitely a sign of things had changed when, being a punk that was into pop punk and all that, it was accepted. You weren't immediately chased down the street by the school bully, for being a little different. And I think that just kind of happens where, like, if a musical genre just never completely goes away, eventually it is accepted by the mainstream,
Yeah, when I think about bands of the early 2000s too, that I like, there's a band that comes to my mind, like, and they kind of put out their first album right around when Fall Out Boy put out their second album, because their first one was a smaller release, but and I still don't know how to classify them. I would be interested to hear what you guys think of this band, but it's Motion City Soundtrack, a band that I love, and they certainly are poppy. They certainly have punk-ish type influences, but I don't know how to categorize a band like that. But when I look to the 2000s, they're probably like, for bands that were new in the early 2000s, they're probably my favorite.
Yeah, they were very consistent, but to me, like, they sounded like they really, really loved the Get Up Kids, a little bit of Braid in the drumming, which has been documented as, like, yes, Damon Atkinson did have an influence on Tony Thaxton's playing,
Right.
but also they really, really liked the Cars and just kind of classic.
Like Weezer too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Weezer's influence cannot be understated. They were just kind of like an alternative rock band in the 90s. Then they became known as an emo band, and like a big influence on pop punk bands, just because of their influence was so widespread. It's just like that's how it was. But just got to reiterate to people, Weezer was a 90s alternative rock band. That was it. Pinkerton was not considered an emo classic. The Blue Album wasn't considered a proto emo, nothing of that. But it's just it's kind of like, I think the Warped Tour really reflected the changing interests of what the teenagers liked. I mean, in the mid to late 90s, it was more of like an extreme sports demonstration with the various kinds of music. They had hip hop, they had punk rock, they had metal bands, they had hardcore bands, but they're often attached to being like, this is like the commercialization of punk and fuck them. But Kevin Lyman ran a very successful tour for many, many years that outlived so many of his peers. And so it just says he was doing something right as far as listening to what teenagers wanted to have. And, people that say, like, started a punk band in 1975 can be all bitter about younger generations. But it's just, hey, the music's just going to keep continuing with or without you.
Yeah, and with the Warped Tour, there was definitely, like, Eric is absolutely right as far as it being a tour that catered to the teenage, age range. Like, I can speak from my own experience being an attendee of that tour in my teenage years. I don't know what actual age it was, but there comes a time, like, when I aged out. Like, it might have been 25, I don't know, but, like, where, 1 year, like, I'm totally a fan of several of the bands, and then the next year's lineup is like complete garbage for me. And so, like, that's like, but I aged out. Like, you're absolutely right, Eric. Like, Kevin Lyman was focused on what teenagers were listening to in that arena, as far as, punk rock music, whatever you want to call it.
And I think that's actually a really interesting point that you make about aging out, because I was running this morning and I was listening to like a 90s indie rock playlist, and like when I hear a song like Cut Your Hair by Pavement, or I don't know, like an Archers of Wolf song or a Helium song, or I mean, I can keep listing them, but like that music doesn't sound, even though it's, I guess, sort of sounds dated in a way, it really doesn't to me, because there's such a layers of depth to it, where I feel like pop punk is very surface level. I think somebody said it earlier, like, my mom sucks, like my job sucks, like, I just want to get laid, like that kind of stuff. You age out of that, I think, a little bit, too, and I can't relate to anything like that. I never really did to begin with, but like, there's very few bands from that era that kind of like matured in a way where it didn't look bad on them. I mean, I think that Green Day is probably like the best example of that, where they like, let classic rock and, the Who and, those kind of like influences like kind of seep into their sound, and it allowed them to be a little bit more timeless. Whereas like some of these Warped Tour bands, like they didn't really grow musically or lyrically as they themselves aged, so it's kind of interesting to kind of think about this like musical genre that is almost like stunted in its growth, that like I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that hear it and it takes them right back to that time, and it's really nostalgic and it's fun and it reminds them of their life before they had mortgages and kids and shit to worry about. Like, I mean, sometimes I eat Taco Bell and I'm like, yeah, man, this reminds me of being like 15. But then I wake up the next day, I'm like, oh my God, why the fuck did I eat Taco Bell? Like my body can't handle this anymore, And so like, I just feel like it's interesting, to think about a musical genre that's very connected to this very short period of people's lives, where a lot of folks, typically end up growing out of it.
Yeah, ska was very much in that same thought pattern.
Yeah, that's interesting because right now when you turn on a corporate classic rock station that still plays like the Eagles and REO Speedwagon, they'll also play Pearl Jam and a couple of select 90s bands. But I wonder, in terms of like legacy radio, how those pop punk bands are going to fit in, because obviously they were huge and they sold millions of records, but like I'll hear Green Day as like you'll hear Green Day on Sirius has a college radio station, or they did, but there'll be there's a metal station in Columbus, 99.7 The Blitz, who plays like the worst of the new metal bands, Five Finger Death Punch and that kind of stuff. But then they'll also throw in like a Green Day song every once in a while, and it'll be an old Green Day song. It'll be like something off of Dookie, or it'll be Nimrod or something like that. But they'll never play Blink-182 because that's too poppy for them. But since there's aggressiveness in some of that Green Day stuff, or they'll play American Idiot because it's got aggressiveness and it's not as sugary in the vocal department. I just wonder where people are going to get that fix. I guess it'll come from streaming and from playlists and stuff, and YouTube playlists and that kind of thing. But
I was going to answer that, Tim, by saying I don't think we'll actually ever, in terms of legacy radio, I don't think we'll ever find out, because I think legacy radio will die out before we would get that answer.
I think as long as there's one baby boomer left, there will be a classic rock radio station to service them, because we can never let the boomers go without having Foreigner and REO Speedwagon and Tin Lizzy for one day. They must have those.
Well, let's not besmirch Thin Lizzy, okay?
I'm sorry. I've heard the boys are back in town 500
Fair
times
enough.
Driving from school and back, which is only a 5-minute drive, and I'm like, they had other songs, right? Like,
right.
I realize your playlist is very narrow and you have to hit the same beats, but like, maybe play one other track. Try to
play some jailbreak.
Throw a little jailbreak in there, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, as somebody that worked in commercial radio for many years, I've just learned to accept that terrestrial radio just is going to be what it's going to be. It's going to be very narrow. But the great thing is that as compared to when we were teenagers and we were younger, there was the radio and MTV. Now we have so many more options that we are never bored with modern music. I mean, we're always getting into new stuff. I mean, whether it's doing a podcast, whether it's sharing playlists on Spotify, or just sharing a YouTube video, there's no shortage of that. And terrestrial radio may very well have like the classic hits format for, yes, I have to say it that way, but it's like that classic hits format where they could play in like 2045. They could play When I Come Around, followed by Pour Some Sugar on Me, and then Time in a Bottle by Jim Croce. It's just like that. That's how it could very well end up. But the great thing is that we have so many different resources that we don't forget about this kind of music that really matters to us. So yeah, I mean, there could definitely, maybe there's some day that a DJ is like, hey, remember the pop punk craze of the 90s? Well, hey, we're gonna play a classic from that, and it's like, come out and play. And
it's complicated by Avril Lavigne.
Yeah, which, but yeah, it's just like terrestrial radio. The reason why I got out of it is that it's not going to go away because it's a free service to a lot of people and there's a strong advertising reach, but it's just going to continue to be run by less and less people. Right. And rather than being the last person to turn out the lights in the office I was working in, I decided to get into a different field.
Well, in the grand scheme of things now, at least it's transparent in that it's music programming for people who don't like music. Like, that's their audience. It's actually like, it's, the people that listen to that are just listening because they want something familiar. They don't actually like music. Right.
It's for the non-adventurous eater. It's right. Like, you want a hamburger? Well, let's go to McDonald's instead of like, well, what about that cool little burger joint that's across the street? I don't know. I don't really trust that. Whereas that seemed to be such the minority. But now, these days, when it comes to music consumption, it's like, just even like the Spotify list of like, you go to a Green Day page and there are 5 recommendations right on their page of like, if you like this, you'll probably also like that.
There were many good pop punk playlists on Apple Music. By the way, so there's no if you're looking to get into the genre, if you miss it the first time, like me, I wasn't in it deeply. I mean, I know some of the big bands, but I did find quite a few that were pretty good.
All right, let's wrap this episode up. I want each of you to select. An alien has just landed, and he has requested your finest pop punk album. What album are you going to gift this very specific alien visitor, who I assume has a CD player or vinyl record, record player in his spacecraft? Ryan, what is your selection for a pop punk album for someone who's never listened to it?
Do I have to?
Yes.
Do I have to? Okay, I'm gonna pick 3 actually, and the reason why is because I think it's important to kind of give a little bit of flavor of what, in my mind, the genre was capable of, and also kind of just tell you what my favorite pop punk-esque records from that era are. So if I was going to do this, I would first hand them Stranger Than Fiction by Bad Religion. I just think that's, while it's not as like corny melodic, harmony, Beach Boys, Ramonesy as, the pop punk of the era. Like, to me, it's just like one of the most kick-ass records by any punk band ever. I just love that record. So that's one. I would give them actually a record by a band that people probably don't classify as pop punk, but to me, they were in that world, and you guys were talking about Motion City Soundtrack earlier, and one of the biggest influences on that band, I think, is Superchunk, and I would give them On the Mouth by Superchunk. And then the last record I would give them, a little bit of a curveball. I think easily you would give them Dookie by Green Day, but I'm going to give them Insomniac by Green Day, which is my favorite Green Day record. So those would be the 3 records I give them, and probably confuse the shit out of the alien. But that's what I'm going to do.
Interesting. Okay. Eric, what's your pick, and maybe around in a runner-up?
Okay. The first one that came to mind, we haven't really talked about it, and that's My Brain Hurts by Screeching Weasel. That's like bam after bam after bam, great song after another. And it just kind of like sums up a lot of like, kind of teenage sort of mentality, but really melodic songs. It's a step beyond just Ramones kind of songwriting. You have like guitar leads over these nice little harmonies of guitars. The other one I would say is Don't Turn Away by Face to Face, just due to the fact that it shows that could be more than just sophomoric humor.
Okay. Jeff, your picks.
You guys are killing me here picking non-pop punk bands in a pop punk band time capsule because you so much want this alien to appreciate punk rock. I love that, but I'm going to stick to the genre. By the way, I agree with Ryan. Insomniac is also my favorite Green Day record.
Yeah.
I'm going to put in... it's really just a matter. I have to pick like 3 as well. I have to go with the Descendants. I'm going to choose Everything Sucks because it is the 90s. I'm going to pick probably one of the most underappreciated bands in this genre in the era, Big Drill Car. I'm going to choose their record No Worse for the Wear. And I am also going to, because it's like kind of like showing all the different spectrums, I'm going to also choose the record It's a Girl by Sweet Baby. She used to be known as Sweet Baby Jesus. Because that's just the wide spectrum. I love that record. It's it's snotty. It's that whole like My Mom Sucks and songs about girls and stuff like that, but great vocal harmonies. And so those are my 3.
Excellent choices, everyone. Superchunk's a weird band because sometimes they're punky sounding and they're obviously very poppy, but they're also can get pretty indie. I don't know how to describe them. They're a hard band to like pin down sound-wise, but that was an interesting choice. I want to mention some comments that we didn't get to. Eric Peterson brought up the Groovy Ghoulies as his favorite pop punk band of the era. He also mentioned 90s Misfits were very poppy. And then bands such as the Vandals, Coxbarrier, which I was not aware of.
Spar.
Okay, Spar. The Rural Juror. And Ian Wobble brought up a band from Australia, the Meanies, which I was not familiar with. So there you go. Thanks to everyone who commented over at our Patreon page. And thanks to our guests for joining us once again. I want to remind everybody, when you go to our website, we have a guests page where if you enjoyed this episode, you can see where our guests have been previously. As you mentioned, they were all on the Power Pop Roundtable, but you might enjoy previous episodes that they've been on for other episodes, roundtables, reviews, that sort of thing. That's digmeoutpodcast.com.
So you can look up Jeff, but I'm telling you now, you're not going to find another episode where he's this angry.
No. He was irate this episode compared to previous episodes.
Guys, I'm going to just confess I drank a protein shake before this recorded, and I'm just full of rage.
Raging. That's awesome.
Well, despite all that rage, never mind. I'm not going to go there.
I'm still just...
I'm not going there.
Yep.
We got to limit the 90s jokes. We got to cut them off at the pass because they're too easy. We need to go to the high road on this. Jeff, Ryan, Eric, thank you all so much for spending your Sunday evening. I'm sorry that you missed the end of the Super Bowl. Whoever won, I'm sure they were deserving of their championship. And congratulations to the Rams. Hopefully they won. I really hope they won. I'll be disappointed if I...
Sorry, dude.
My attitude is...
At this point, it's like Schrodinger's cat. I don't know if they won or lost. So to me, they won. So just leave me in sort of bliss right now. I don't know. Either way. So they won.
Spoken like a true Bills fan.
Exactly.
Instead of just like complaining on social media about the commercials as well as the game, we actually did something fun.
We did something important, Eric. We did something meaningful We have hopefully helped people understand the difference between punk and pop punk, and maybe set some people straight. Maybe we've confused some people even more. Who knows what happens? But they can comment at Facebook or Twitter, Instagram on this episode, and of course join us over at Patreon, patreon.com/digmeout. Join our board of directors, become a union member, get a cool sticker, t-shirts, that kind of stuff. Vote in our polls, and you can leave us some positive feedback at iTunes. So, Eric, Ryan, Jeff, thank you once again for coming back, gentlemen. Greatly appreciate it. You're welcome back anytime. And for Jay, I'm Tim. We're out, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Dig Me Out.
Thanks for listening. To support the podcast, visit www.patreon.com/digmeout and become a monthly subscriber at www.digmeoutpodcast.com, where you can find links to our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages, as well as our merchandise store at Zazzle.com.